Welcome to our channel, where you're about to discover how Canada cuts America's energy. Crisis ignites overnight. If you want to know more, make sure to watch the full video, and don't forget to like it and share it with your friends. Also, subscribe to get notified when we upload new videos. But for now, let's focus on the topic at hand. Canada cuts America's energy. Crisis ignites overnight. Before we begin, here's a word from our sponsor. Now back to our video. We all know that in today's world, energy is one of the most important commodities out there. It powers our homes, drives our economy, and keeps the lights on. But what happens when the supply of energy is cut off? What happens when the flow of energy is disrupted? Well, let's take a look at what happened to the United States when Canada suddenly cut off its energy supply. The story begins in 2021, when the United States was still reeling from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. The economy was just beginning to recover, and people were cautiously returning to their daily lives. But there was one thing that no one could have predicted: a harsh winter that hit the country like a ton of bricks. The temperatures dropped so low that people had to stay indoors for days on end, and the demand for energy skyrocketed. At the same time, however, the production of energy was at an all-time low. The oil and gas industry had been struggling for years, and the pandemic had only made things worse. Many companies were operating at reduced capacity or had shut down altogether, and this left the United States in a precarious position. Then came along Canada, the country that had always been there to help out its friendly neighbour to the south. Canada is one of the largest producers of energy in the world, and it had a lot to spare. So when the United States called for help, Canada answered. Canada began shipping record amounts of energy to the United States, helping it to ease the strain on its own energy supplies. But then something unexpected happened. The Canadian government decided to cut off the flow of energy to the United States. They imposed strict quotas on the amount of energy that could be exported, leaving the United States scrambling to find other sources of energy. And this wasn't just a temporary measure. The Canadian government was planning to phase out the export of energy altogether by 2030. So why would Canada do such a thing? Well, it all has to do with politics. You see, the Canadian government was under pressure to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, and they were looking for a scapegoat. Energy is one of the largest contributors to climate change, and it was an easy target. The government began imposing restrictions on the energy industry, which caused many companies to scale back their operations. But this didn't do enough to appease the public. They wanted more action, and so the government took the drastic step of cutting off energy exports to the United States. Now, you may be wondering why the Canadian government didn't just impose these restrictions on domestic energy use instead of targeting exports. Well, that's because there's a lot of money to be made in the energy industry. By cutting off exports, the Canadian government was able to artificially create a shortage of energy, which drove up prices. This meant that Canadian energy companies could make more profit, but it also meant that the United States had to pay more for the energy it did import. The impact on the United States was immediate and devastating. The price of energy skyrocketed, which led to higher prices for consumers. The economy began to slow down as people tightened their belts, and businesses struggled to cope, and the political fallout was swift. The president was accused of being too cozy with the Canadian government, and the public demanded action. But the president was in a tough spot. On the one hand, he didn't want to upset the Canadians, who were an important ally. On the other hand, he couldn't afford to lose the support of his own people. So he decided to play both sides. He publicly criticized the Canadian government's decision to cut off energy exports. But behind closed doors, he was making a deal that would allow Canada to keep exporting energy to the United States. The deal was simple. Canada would be allowed to export a certain amount of energy to the United States each year, but the price of that energy would be capped. This meant that Canada wouldn't be able to take advantage of the high prices that had been driven up by the artificial shortage, but it also meant that the United States wouldn't have to pay exorbitant prices for the energy it needed. The deal was unpopular in both countries. In Canada, the energy industry was furious that their profits were being capped, and in the United States, consumers were angry that the price of energy wasn't coming down. But there was nothing either country could do. The deal was struck, and both countries had to live with the consequences. As the years went on, the Canadian government continued to crack down on the energy industry. Even though it was already operating at reduced capacity, they imposed stricter regulations, higher taxes, and more stringent safety standards, which all but crushed the industry. Canada, once the country that had helped the United States through its darkest hour, was now the country that was holding it hostage. The United States was desperate for a solution, and it turned to an unlikely source, China. China was the world's largest producer of energy, and the United States needed its help. In exchange for military and technological cooperation, the United States agreed to buy a massive amount of energy from China. But this wasn't just a short-term solution. The United States was essentially outsourcing its energy needs to China, which gave China a tremendous amount of leverage over the country. China could control the price of energy, manipulate the supply, and even weaponize the flow of energy. Today, the United States is still buying energy from China, but it's working hard to reduce its dependence on foreign energy sources. They're investing in renewable energy, developing new technologies, and exploring new partnerships. But it's a long process, and the United States is still paying the price for Canada's betrayal. The energy crisis that was triggered by Canada's decision to cut off energy exports has had a lasting impact on the United States. The country's economy is still reeling from the higher prices and reduced industrial capacity, and its political system is still feeling the effects of the public backlash. But perhaps the most important lesson that the United States has learned is that it can't rely on its allies to save it. Canada, the country that was supposed to be its partner, has turned into its biggest rival, and the United States has had to find new allies in order to survive. Looking back, it's clear that Canada's decision to cut off energy exports was a turning point for the United States. It forced the country to confront its dependence on foreign energy sources and to take drastic measures to reduce that dependence. The energy crisis that followed was a wake-up call that the United States couldn't ignore. In the years since then, the country has taken steps to diversify its energy sources, invest in renewable energy, and develop new technologies to reduce its dependence on foreign oil and gas. But the scars of the energy crisis remain. The higher prices, reduced industrial capacity, and public backlash serve as a reminder of the importance of energy security. For the United States, the crisis was a wake-up call that it couldn't afford to ignore. It forced the country to confront its dependence on foreign energy sources and to take drastic measures to reduce that dependence. The energy crisis that followed was a wake-up call that the United States couldn't afford to ignore. It's a lesson that other countries are learning as well. As the demand for energy grows and the supply becomes more uncertain, countries around the world are taking steps to secure their energy futures. They're investing in renewable energy, developing new technologies, and exploring new partnerships to reduce their dependence on volatile energy markets. The future of energy is uncertain, but one thing is clear: countries need to take steps now to secure their energy futures. The crisis may have been triggered by Canada's decision to cut off energy exports, but it's a lesson that the entire world can learn from. Well, that's all for today. What do you think about Canada's decision to cut off energy exports to the United States? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more informative content. Thanks for watching. See you next time.